"Oh my God, who did this to you?" Elena's voice cracked as the flashlight trembled in her hand. The narrow beam cut through the damp darkness and landed on a man collapsed on the concrete floor. Blood, dried and fresh, pulled beneath him like a dark halo. His white shirt was soaked crimson, torn open to reveal a gunshot wound in his shoulder and a deep gash across his ribs. His face was bruised beyond recognition, his breathing shallow, his skin pale as ash. Her heart hammered so hard she could hear it in her ears. The basement smelled of rust, mildew, and something metallic, something dying. This was supposed to be a simple cleaning job one afternoon in a vacant mansion on the quiet edge of South Boston. The realtor had smiled, casual as could be, saying it had been empty for months with nothing but dust and cobwebs. Now there was a living man bleeding out in the shadows. She knelt despite herself, old instincts rising from a life she thought she had buried. 2 years of nursing school before Noah came, before Derek, before everything fell apart. She pressed her hands against the wound in his side, feeling the wet warmth seep through her fingers. He groaned, eyes fluttering open. Gray eyes, cold and sharp even through the haze of pain. "Don't," he rasped, grabbing her wrist with surprising strength. "Don't call anyone. You'll die if I don't help you. I'll die faster if you do." Elena froze, her thumb hovering over the emergency dial on her cracked screen, her breath hitching in her throat as the man's grip tightened around her wrist like a vice made of dying steel. His warning hung in the damp air between them, heavy and absolute, cutting through her panic with a terrifying clarity that froze her blood colder than the basement floor. She looked down at him, really looked at him this time, searching the blood-smeared features for any sign of madness, but found only a grim, lethal certainty in those gray eyes that refused to dim even as life leaked out of him. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, her voice trembling as she lowered the phone slowly, instinctively obeying the command of a man who looked like he shouldn't even have the strength to speak. "If I don't call an ambulance, you're going to bleed out right here on this floor." The man let out a ragged breath, his head falling back against the concrete with a wet thud, his chest heaving as he fought for enough air to form words. "No ambulance," he gritted out through clenched teeth, sweat beading on his forehead as a fresh wave of agony rolled through him. "The people who did this, they own the ambulances, they own the police, and if you make that call, they'll find us both before the sirens even stop wailing." Elena's mind raced, spinning through 1,000 terrified calculations as she stared at the carnage in front of her, the reality of her situation crashing down like a collapsing wall. She was just a cleaner, and nobody trying to scrape together enough cash for Noah's tuition and the rent that was 3 weeks overdue, not a player in some violent underworld drama. But the nursing training she had abandoned years ago screamed at her to move, to act, to stop the red tide pulling beneath his flank before it was too late. She yanked her wrist free, not to run, but to drop her bag onto the floor, the sound of zippers tearing open echoing loudly in the silence. "Fine," she said, her voice shaking but hardening with a sudden resolve born of necessity. "No police, but I'm not going to sit here and watch you die either." She pulled out a clean stack of microfiber cloths, a bottle of distilled water she kept for mixing cleaning solutions, and a small first aid kit she carried for occupational hazards. It wasn't a trauma center, but it was all they had. She poured the water over her hands to rinse off the basement grit, the icy liquid stinging her skin, and turned back to him. "This is going to hurt," she warned softly, positioning her hands over the jagged tear in his side where a knife had clearly done its dirty work. He didn't flinch as she pressed the cloth against the wound, though a low, guttural growl vibrated in his chest, a sound of raw pain suppressed by an iron that frightened her almost as much as his injuries. The white cloth turned crimson in seconds, soaking up the life that was draining out of him, and Elena pressed harder, putting her entire body weight behind the compression. "Talk to me," she ordered, needing to keep him conscious, needing to anchor herself against the horror of feeling warm blood slicking her fingers. "What's your name?" "I can't just call you hey you while I'm trying to save your life." The man watched her through half-lidded eyes, studying her face with an intensity that made her feel like she was being dissected, evaluated for weakness or treachery. Dominic, he finally murmured, the name sliding out on a sigh of exhaustion. Dominic Crane. The name hit Elena like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs and making the basement spin dizzily around her. Dominic Crane. The name was plastered on billboards all over downtown, on the towering casino that dominated the skyline, on the front pages of newspapers that speculated wildly about his sudden disappearance 3 weeks ago. She pulled back slightly, her eyes widening as she connected the dots between the powerful billionaire in the pressed suits on the news and the broken, bloody wreck lying at her knees. "You're him," she breathed, the realization bringing a fresh wave of terror that made her hands tremble against his ribs. "Everyone thinks you're on a private island or dead." A bitter, humorless smile ghosted across his lips, staining his teeth with blood as he let out a dry, rattling cough. "My brother prefers the second option," he rasped, the betrayal in his voice sharp enough to cut glass. He decided the inheritance was taking too long, so he sped up the timeline. Elena swallowed hard, the taste of bile rising in her throat as she realized exactly what she had walked into. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a random act of violence. This was a fratricide, a carefully orchestrated execution happening in the silence of a house that was supposed to be empty. "Your brother," she repeated, the words feeling heavy and dangerous on her tongue. "He did this to you?" Dominic nodded imperceptibly, his gaze drifting toward the ceiling as if he could see through the floorboards to the world above that had forgotten him. "Marcus," he whispered, the name carrying a weight of sorrow that surprised her. "He didn't have the guts to finish it quickly, so he left me here to rot." Elena worked in silence for a moment, her mind reeling as she packed the wound with fresh gauze from her kit, taping it down with trembling fingers while trying to process the magnitude of the danger she was in. If Marcus Crane, a man ruthless enough to butcher his own brother, found her here, she wouldn't just be fired, she would be erased. She thought of Noah, her 6-year-old son waiting for her at Mrs. Patterson's apartment, his innocent face flashing in her mind like a beacon of everything she had to lose. "I have a son," she blurted out, the confession tearing out of her before she could stop it, a desperate plea for him to understand why her hands were shaking. "If I get involved in this, if they find me." Dominic's hand shot out again, weaker this time but desperate, his fingers brushing against her arm. "That's why you can't call," he insisted, his eyes locking onto hers with a fierce intensity. "Marcus has eyes everywhere. The precinct, the hospitals. You make one call, and they trace it back to you. They won't just come for me. They'll come for anyone who knows I'm alive." The threat hung in the air, sickening and real, effectively sealing the trap around them. Elena looked at the man who held the keys to the city's underworld, seeing not a monster, but a human being who had been discarded like trash, and she knew with a sinking heart that she was trapped. She finished binding his shoulder, using strips torn from her own spare cleaning shirt, because the gauze had run out, her movements efficient and practiced despite the fear coursing through her veins. "The bleeding is slowing down," she said, her voice finding a fragile steadiness as she fell back into the clinical detachment she had learned during her nursing rotations. "But you're dehydrated, and that wound on your ribs is going to get infected if you don't get real antibiotics soon." Dominic looked up at her, the ghost of a smile touching his lips again, this time with something that looked almost like gratitude. "You're good at this," he murmured, his eyelids drooping as the adrenaline began to fade, leaving him vulnerable to the crushing weight of shock. "Better than the butchers my family hires." Elena sat back on her heels, wiping her blood-stained hands on her jeans, feeling the sticky, metallic residue that would take days to scrub from her memory. "I was almost a nurse," she said quietly, staring at the ruin of his shirt. Life had other plans. Before Dominic could respond, a sound from above froze the blood in Elena's veins, the heavy, distinct thud of a front door slamming shut, followed by the muffled cadence of footsteps walking across the hardwood floor directly over their heads. Dominic's eyes snapped open, wide and alert, the lethargy vanishing instantly as pure, primal instinct took over. "He's back," he hissed, the warning barely audible, but it screamed through the silence of the basement like a siren. "Hide. Now." Elena scrambled backward, her heart slamming against her ribs like a trapped bird, her eyes darting frantically around the shadowed room for any cover. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, moving with purpose toward the door that led down to the darkness where they were hiding. She grabbed her bag, shoving the bloody cloths inside in a panic, and looked at Dominic one last time. He lay perfectly still, composing his features into a mask of death, preparing to play the corpse his brother wanted him to be. "Go," he mouthed, his gray eyes burning with a command she couldn't disobey. Elena threw herself behind a stack of old cardboard boxes in the far corner, pressing her body into the dust and spiderwebs, holding her breath until her lungs burned. The door at the top of the stairs creaked open, spilling a wedge of yellow electric light down the steps, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, mocking stars. The heavy footsteps descended the wooden stairs with a slow, deliberate cadence that sounded less like a man walking and more like a predator stalking prey. Elena pressed her hand over her mouth, her body trembling violently behind the stack of cardboard boxes, dust motes dancing in the sliver of light that cut through the gloom. Through the narrow gap between the boxes, she saw him. He was tall, dressed in a tailored charcoal coat that cost more than her entire year's salary, his hair perfectly styled, his face a chilling, unblemished mirror of the broken man lying on the floor. Marcus Crane didn't look like a murderer. He looked like a CEO, a man who signed death warrants with a fountain pen rather than a knife. But the cold emptiness in his gray eyes betrayed the monster beneath the polish. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs, pulling a pristine white handkerchief from his pocket to cover his nose as he surveyed the damp, blood-scented basement with a look of utter disgust. His gaze flicked dismissively over Dominic's motionless body, showing no remorse, no flicker of brotherly love, only the annoyance one might feel toward a piece of trash that hadn't been taken out yet. Elena squeezed her eyes shut, praying to a god she hadn't spoken to in years that he would turn around and leave, but fate was not that kind. A sharp, metallic vibration buzzed against the concrete floor, her phone. She had dropped it when she scrambled for cover, and now it sat exposed in the open, the screen lighting up with a spam call that felt like a death knell in the silence. Marcus froze, his head snapping toward the sound, his eyes narrowing as they landed on the glowing device and the open medical bag beside it. "Come out," he said, his voice smooth and calm, devoid of shouting, but carrying a terrifying weight of authority. "I know you're there, and I don't have the patience for hide and seek." Elena's heart stopped, then restarted with a frantic, painful rhythm. There was no way out. If she stayed, he would drag her out. If she ran, he would catch her. With legs that felt like they were made of lead, she slowly stood up from behind the boxes, raising her hands in a gesture of surrender that felt pathetically small against the threat standing before her. "I'm the cleaner," she stammered, the words tumbling out in a breathless rush as she tried to force her voice to sound steady, to play the part of the confused, innocent worker. "The realtor sent me. I just got here. I didn't see anything, I swear." Marcus watched her emerge, his expression shifting from mild irritation to predatory amusement as he looked her up and down, assessing her cheap uniform, her worn shoes, the terror radiating off her in waves. He didn't believe her, not for a second, but he didn't seem threatened either. To him, she was just an insect that had wandered into a spider's web. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them with a few long strides until he was towering over her, the smell of expensive cologne clashing violently with the copper scent of blood. "You just got here," he repeated, his tone mocking as he glanced at the bloody gauze peeking out of her bag. "And you decided to start your cleaning duties by patching up a quartz?" He moved faster than she thought possible, his hand shooting out to wrap around her throat, slamming her back against the rough concrete wall with a force that knocked the wind out of her lungs. Elena clawed at his hand, her fingernails scraping uselessly against his leather gloves, black spots dancing in her vision as his grip tightened, cutting off her air. "Please," she choked out, tears leaking from her eyes as she stared into the face of a man who had clearly done this before. "I won't say anything. I have a son. Please." Something flickered in Marcus's eyes at the mention of her child, not mercy, but a sudden, sharp calculation. He loosened his grip just enough for her to gasp in a ragged breath, reaching into her apron pocket with his free hand to fish out her wallet. He flipped it open, scanning her driver's license with a terrifying detachment. Elena Vance, he read aloud, committing the name to memory like a weapon he intended to use later. 127 Maple Street. And a son. He looked back at her, his smile thin and cruel. If you breathe a word of this to anyone, the police, the press, your priest, I won't come for you, Elena. I'll go to Maple Street first. He leaned in close, his breath hot against her ear, whispering the nightmare into existence. I will erase everything you love. Your boy won't even make it to the school bus. He released her abruptly, shoving her away as if touching her had soiled him. Elena slid down the wall, coughing and gasping, clutching her bruised throat as the reality of his threat sank into her bones. He wasn't just threatening her life. He was holding Noah hostage, binding her silence with the life of her child. Marcus straightened his coat, checking his cuffs for any specks of dust, his demeanor reverting instantly to that of the board executive. Get out, he ordered, gesturing vaguely toward the stairs without even looking at her. And remember, I have eyes everywhere. If I see your face again, if I even hear your name, you'll wish you were dead. He turned his back on her, walking over to Dominic's body and delivering a vicious kick to his brother's wounded ribs, a final act of petty cruelty to ensure there was no fight left in him. Dominic didn't move, didn't make a sound, playing his part perfectly, but Elena saw his hand twitch imperceptibly in the shadows. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing her bag and fleeing up the stairs, her lungs burning, her heart shattering, leaving the man she had just saved alone in the dark with the monster who wanted him dead. Elena bolted the door of her apartment the moment she stepped inside, her trembling fingers fumbling with the deadbolt, the chain, and the latch as if 3 layers of cheap metal could stop a man like Marcus Crane. She pressed her back against the door and slid down to the floor, her knees pulled tight against her chest, listening to the silence of her own home with the ears of a hunted animal. The familiar hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside usually brought her comfort, but tonight they felt like a flimsy veil over a terrifying reality. She crawled to the window, peering through the slats of the blinds, her heart hammering against her ribs as she scanned the street below for black sedans or men standing in the shadows. The street was empty, bathed in the orange glow of the streetlights, but the threat remained, hanging in the air like smoke. Marcus knew her name. He knew where she lived. And worst of all, he knew about Noah. She went into her son's bedroom, moving silently across the creaky floorboards to stand beside his bed. Noah was asleep, one arm thrown over his head, his breathing deep and even, completely unaware that his mother had just looked the devil in the eye and bargained for his life. Elena brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead, her hand shaking so badly she had to pull it back before she woke him. A wave of nausea rolled through her as Marcus's voice echoed in her mind, cold and precise, threatening to erase her boy before he could even reach the school bus. Every instinct she had screamed at her to pack a bag, grab Noah, and run until the gas ran out, but Dominic's warning pinned her in place. Marcus had eyes everywhere. If she ran, she would look guilty. If she ran, they would hunt her down. The only safety lay in invisibility, in pretending she was exactly what Marcus thought she was, a terrified, insignificant cleaner who would keep her mouth shut to survive. Sleep was a ghost that refused to visit her that night. Elena sat at her small kitchen table as the hours ticked by, her hands wrapped around a mug of cold tea she hadn't taken a sip of. In front of her lay her old nursing textbooks, dusty and worn, stacked beneath a pile of unpaid bills. She stared at the spine of an anatomy book, her mind drifting back to a night 7 years ago, the night she had finally fled from her ex-husband, Derek. She remembered running through the snow in her socks, blood trickling from a cut above her eyebrow, banging on neighbors' doors, begging for a phone, for help, for sanctuary. She saw the curtains twitch. She saw lights turn off. She heard the locks click shut as people decided that her pain was too messy, too dangerous to get involved with. She had survived that night huddled in a garden shed, freezing and alone, learning the hardest lesson of her life. When you are broken and bleeding in the dark, the world doesn't send a savior. It turns up the volume on the TV so it doesn't have to hear you scream. The memory hardened something inside her chest, a jagged piece of resolve that cut through the fear. Dominic Crane was a criminal, a man who built an empire on vice and violence, but right now, he was just a human being left to rot in a basement by his own brother. He was the person banging on the door, and she was the neighbor standing with her hand on the curtain. If she stayed here, safe and warm, pretending she hadn't seen anything, she was no better than the people who had left her to freeze. She was proving Marcus right, that fear was the only law that mattered, that the strong could crush the weak and no one would lift a finger to stop it. Elena stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the linoleum. She couldn't save the world. She couldn't fight the Mafia. But she could not live with herself if she became one of the people who turned away. She moved quickly before her courage could abandon her, raiding the bathroom cabinet with frantic efficiency. She grabbed the bottle of antibiotics left over from Noah's ear infection last winter. They were expired by a few months, but they were better than nothing against the sepsis that was surely setting in. She swept a box of gauze pads, a roll of athletic tape, a bottle of high-proof rubbing alcohol, and a handful of ibuprofen into her worn canvas bag. In the kitchen, she added 3 bottles of water, a loaf of bread, and a box of protein bars, her mind racing through the inventory of what a dying man needed to survive another day. It was a meager arsenal against a gunshot wound and a knife slash, but it was all she had. Elena sat down to write a note to Mrs. Patterson next door, her hand steady now as the decision settled into her bones. She lied about picking up an extra early shift and asked the elderly neighbor to get Noah on the school bus in the morning. It was a risk leaving him, but bringing him with her was a death sentence, and staying home was a moral surrender she couldn't accept. She zipped the bag shut, the sound sharp and final in the quiet apartment. She wasn't doing this for money, and she certainly wasn't doing it because she had a death wish. She was going back because she knew exactly how cold the darkness got when you are alone in it. Dominic Crane might be a king in his world, but in that basement, he was just a man who needed a hand to hold, and Elena refused to be the one who kept her hands in her pockets. The back door of the mansion resisted for a moment before the old lock gave way with a sharp click that sounded like a gunshot in the silence of the twilight. Elena froze, waiting for an alarm, a shout, or the heavy tread of Marcus's shoes, but only the wind whistled through the leafless trees in the backyard. She slipped inside, locking the door behind her with trembling hands, and moved toward the basement door like a diver stepping off a cliff into deep water. The air grew heavier as she descended the stairs, the temperature dropping with every step, but it was the smell that hit her first. It wasn't just the metallic tang of old blood anymore. It was something sweeter, thicker, and far more terrifying. It was the scent of rot, the smell of a body fighting a losing battle against itself. She reached the bottom step and swept her flashlight beam across the room, her breath catching in her throat when the light found him. Dominic hadn't moved an inch from where she had left him the day before, but he looked devastatingly worse. He was thrashing weakly against the concrete floor, his head tossing from side to side in the grip of a violent fever dream. His skin, which had been pale as ash yesterday, was now flushed with an angry, unnatural heat that radiated off him in waves. Elena dropped her bag and fell to her knees beside him, stripping off her gloves to press the back of her hand against his forehead. He was burning up. "Dominic," she whispered urgently, shaking his shoulder. "Dominic, can you hear me?" His eyes flew open, but they didn't see her. The gray irises were blown wide, clouded with delirium, staring past her at demons only he could see. "Get back," he slurred, lashing out with a clumsy, weakened swing that barely grazed her arm. "I won't sign. Tell him I won't sign." He was fighting his brother in his mind, reliving the betrayal over and over again. Elena caught his wrist, pinning it to the floor with surprising ease, and the lack of resistance terrified her more than his aggression. He was fading. The infection had moved fast, seizing the opportunity provided by the filth of the basement and his weakened immune system. She wasted no time on pleasantries or reassurance. There was no room for softness when death was standing in the corner of the room. She reached for the hem of his ruined shirt and peeled the fabric away from his ribs, bracing herself for what lay beneath. The makeshift bandage she had applied was soaked through with yellow and green discharge, the skin around the knife wound angry and swollen tight as a drum. "Okay," she breathed, forcing her nurse's training to override her nausea. "We have to clean this up." "I'm sorry, Dominic. I am so sorry." She soaked a massive wad of cotton in the rubbing alcohol she had stolen, knowing this was going to be agony, but there was no other way to kill the bacteria eating him alive. She pressed the alcohol-soaked pad directly into the infected gash. Dominic's back arched off the floor, a guttural scream tearing from his throat that was raw with pain, his muscles locking rigid as his body tried to escape the burning sting. Elena didn't stop. She held him down with her forearm across his chest, scrubbing the wound clean with ruthless efficiency, washing away the pus and the rot until fresh, clean blood began to flow again. He collapsed back onto the concrete, panting in shallow, ragged gasps, sweat soaking his hair and running down his temples. Elena worked quickly, dusting the area with antibiotic powder and covering it with a fresh, sterile dressing, taping it down securely. Then came the pills. She crushed the antibiotics and the fever reducers into a fine powder, mixing them with a little water in a bottle cap because he was too delirious to swallow whole tablets. She lifted his head, cradling it in her lap like he was Noah, and tipped the mixture into his mouth. "Drink," she commanded softly, stroking his throat to trigger the swallow reflex. "You have to drink." He choked, coughed, but eventually the medicine went down. She spent the next hour trickling water into him sip by sip, wiping his burning face with a cool, damp cloth, murmuring quiet, nonsensical words just to keep him tethered to reality. Slowly, agonizingly, the heat began to break. His breathing deepened, losing that terrifying rattle, and the flush on his cheeks receded to a pale, exhaustion-lined gray. Elena sat with her back against the cold wall, Dominic's head still resting on her thigh, her hand absent-mindedly carding through his sweat-dampened hair. She was exhausted, her own adrenaline crash leaving her shaking, but she didn't dare move. Sometime around midnight, she felt him shift. She looked down to find his eyes open. They were clear now. The haze of fever was gone, replaced by a sharp, stunned clarity as he looked up at her face. He didn't speak for a long time, just stared at her as if he were trying to solve a complex equation. He looked at the fresh bandages on his chest, then at the water bottle beside him, and finally back to her eyes. "You came back," he rasped, his voice sounding like it had been dragged over gravel. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of absolute disbelief. "I told you to run. I told you he would kill you." Elena stopped stroking his hair but didn't push him away. She picked up the water bottle and held it to his lips, letting him take a long, desperate drink before she answered. "You did," she said simply. "And he might." Dominic pulled away from the water, his gaze searching hers with an intensity that made her chest ache. He had clearly spent a lifetime surrounded by people who weighed his value in stock auctions and power, people who cut their losses the moment he became a liability. The idea that a stranger, a woman with everything to lose and nothing to gain, would return to a death trap for him seemed to break something in his understanding of the world. "Why?" he asked, the single word heavy with confusion. "You don't owe me anything. You don't even know me." Elena looked down at her hands, the same hands that had scrubbed floors for minimum wage, the hands that had been bruised by a husband who promised to love her, the hands that had just saved a king's life. "I know enough," she said softly, her voice echoing in the quiet basement. "I know what it feels like to lie in the dark, bleeding and praying for someone to come, and realizing that no one is coming." She met his gaze, her brown eyes steady and fierce. "I waited a long time for a savior, Dominic. Eventually, I had to save myself. But I promised myself that if I ever found someone else in the dark, I wouldn't leave them there." Dominic stared at her, his walls crumbling in the silence. For the first time, He wasn't looking at a servant or a liability. He was looking at the only person in the world who had seen him at his weakest and chosen to stay. "I'm not worth dying for," he whispered, a flash of self-loathing darkening his face. Elena offered him a small, sad smile. "Let me decide that." The basement, once a tomb of silence and rot, had transformed into a strange, suspended reality where time was measured not in hours, but in the rhythm of shallow breaths and the changing of bandages. On the third day, Dominic was strong enough to sit up against the concrete wall, his face still pale, but possessing a sharpness that the fever had previously dulled. Elena sat cross-legged opposite him, unwrapping the gauze from his ribs with hands that had stopped trembling days ago. The angry red swelling around the knife wound had subsided, leaving behind a jagged, ugly line that would forever mark him, but the heat of infection was gone. Dominic watched her work with a brooding intensity, his gray eyes tracking every movement of her fingers as if trying to memorize the sensation of gentleness. He was a man accustomed to transactions, to people who touched him only to take something, money, power, influence, yet here was a woman who touched him only to heal. The silence between them felt heavy, not with threat, but with the unasked questions that had been circling in the damp air since the fever broke. Finally, Dominic broke it, his voice low and rough, sounding like dry leaves dragging over stone. "Marcus is my half-brother," he said, staring up at the lone, dust-caked bulb hanging from the ceiling. "Same father, different mothers. My father was a man who believed in legacy above all else, and I was the legitimate heir, while Marcus was the mistake he kept in the guest house." Elena's hands paused for a fraction of a second before she resumed applying the fresh dressing, her eyes flicking up to his face. She didn't interrupt, sensing that this confession was a wound he needed to drain just as badly as the one in his side. "I spent my whole life trying to make up for a sin I didn't commit," Dominic continued, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "I gave him control of the casinos, the shipping lines, a seat at the table. I thought if I gave him enough power, he would stop hating me for being the favorite." He laughed softly, a hollow sound that lacked any humor. "But you can't fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom, can you?" Marcus didn't want a seat at the table, Elena. He wanted to be the only one sitting there. He looked down at his hands, likely remembering the moment his brother's knife had slid between his ribs. The betrayal wasn't just political, it was the culmination of a lifetime of festering resentment, a poison that Dominic had foolishly mistook for brotherly rivalry. "I was the king of Boston," he whispered, the title sounding ridiculous in the damp basement. "And I was too blind to see that the person standing closest to me was holding a dagger." Elena finished taping the bandage and sat back, wiping her hands on her apron. She understood that kind of blindness, the willful ignorance born of a desperate need to be loved. "It wasn't your fault," she said quietly, her voice firm in the gloom. "You can't save someone who wants to drown just to pull you down with them." Dominic looked at her, really looked at her, his gaze dropping to the faint, white scar that ran along her hairline, a souvenir she usually hid behind her bangs. "And who are you trying to save?" he asked, turning the spotlight onto her. "You said you knew what it was like to wait for a savior. Who put that fear in your eyes?" Elena instinctively reached up to touch the scar, her fingers tracing the old ridge of healed skin. She hadn't spoken about Derek in years, not since the police report she had filed the day she left, but in the dark with a man who had been broken by his own blood, the truth felt easier to speak. "His name was Derek," she began, staring at a crack in the concrete floor. "He wasn't a king. He was a shift manager at a warehouse, charming and funny until the ring was on my finger." She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them as the cold memories washed over her. "It started small. A criticism of my cooking, a shove when he was drunk. Then he isolated me. He told me my friends didn't like me, that my family looked down on me. He built a wall around us brick by brick until I was invisible to the rest of the world." Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to continue. "I stayed for 3 years. I stayed because I thought if I just loved him enough, if I was just perfect enough, he would go back to being the man I married. But love doesn't fix a man who enjoys breaking things." She looked up, meeting Dominic's gaze. When I found out I was pregnant with Noah, I knew. I knew if I stayed, my son would grow up watching his father hit his mother, or worse, he'd grow up to be just like him. So I ran. I packed a bag in the middle of the night and I never looked back. Dominic listened in silence, his expression unreadable, but the harshness in his eyes had softened into something profound and tragic. He reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on her knee, his skin rough and warm. "We're a pair, aren't we?" he murmured. "The king and the cleaner. Both of us surrounded by people, yet completely alone." It was a realization that hung between them, stripping away the social chasm that separated their worlds. Dominic had been isolated by his power, placed on a pedestal where no one could reach him without an agenda. Elena had been isolated by her poverty and abuse, rendered invisible by a society that preferred not to look at uncomfortable truths. They were two survivors who had been hollowed out by the people who were supposed to protect them. "I have spent my life building walls to keep people out," Dominic admitted, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I thought safety meant being untouchable. But lying here, watching you come back day after day, I realize I was just locking myself in." Elena turned her hand over, lacing her fingers with his, a gesture of intimacy that felt more dangerous than the gunshots. "Walls keep you safe," she whispered, her throat tight. "But they also keep out the light." For a long moment, there was no Mafia, no debts, no threats. There were just two broken people in a basement, recognizing the jagged edges of each other's souls and realizing that, for the first time in a long time, they fit together. The bond that formed in that silence was stronger than gratitude. It was an alliance of the lonely, a pact forged in the understanding that they were no longer fighting the dark alone. The tentative peace of the afternoon shattered with the grinding crunch of heavy tires rolling over the gravel driveway outside, a sound that cut through the basement silence like a scream. Elena froze mid-motion, the damp cloth she had been using to wipe Dominic's bra hovering in the air, her eyes locking onto his with wide, terrified panic. "He's early," Dominic hissed, the lethargy of his recovery vanishing instantly as his survival instincts snapped into place like a loaded weapon. "Hide. Now." Elena didn't waste a second asking questions, scrambling backward on her hands and knees toward the towering stack of cardboard boxes in the far corner where shadows gathered thickest. She wedged herself into the narrow gap between the dusty cartons and the cold concrete wall, curling her body into a ball so tight her muscles ached. She pulled the edges of her gray cardigan around her, trying to make herself small, trying to become nothing more than another shadow in the dark. Dominic slumped back against the floor, letting his head loll to the side and his mouth fall open, perfectly mimicking the unconscious stupor of a man slowly dying from sepsis. The heavy oak door at the top of the stairs groaned open, and the rhythmic thud of expensive leather shoes descended into the gloom. Marcus Crane stepped into the light, a silhouette of tailored perfection against the backdrop of filth, pressing a phone to his ear with an expression of bored irritation. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs, his gaze sweeping over Dominic's prone form with a cold detachment that made Elena's stomach turn. "I'm looking at him right now, Roman," Marcus said into the phone, his voice smooth and devoid of any brotherly concern. "He hasn't moved in days. It's just a matter of time before the infection finishes what the knife started." Elena pressed a hand over her mouth to stifle the whimper rising in her throat as she watched Marcus walk casually toward his brother. Without breaking his stride or his conversation, Marcus drew his foot back and delivered a vicious, sickening kick straight into Dominic's bandaged ribs. The sound of the impact echoed off the walls, a dull thud of shoe against bruised flesh. Dominic didn't cry out, didn't flinch, didn't even twitch, absorbing the agony with a terrifying discipline born of pure will. "See? Nothing," Marcus laughed, turning away as if he had just kicked a stray dog, oblivious to the fact that the man on the floor was awake and memorizing every second of this torment. "Wednesday is perfect for the announcement," he continued, pacing the small room like a caged tiger measuring its territory. "We'll hold the press conference at the Crown Hotel. I'll play the grieving brother. You play the supportive rival burying the hatchet. We divide the territories by Friday, and the Crane Empire is history." Elena's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she was sure he could hear it, the blood rushing in her ears like a roaring river. Wednesday. That was only 3 days away. They didn't have weeks or even days to plan an escape. The clock had just jumped forward, stripping away their margin for error. Marcus turned, his pacing bringing him closer to her hiding spot, the heels of his shoes clicking sharply on the concrete. Then he stopped. The air in the basement went still, charged with a sudden, lethal tension. Marcus lifted his head, sniffing the air like a hound catching a scent on the wind, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Hold on," he muttered into the phone, lowering the device slowly as his eyes narrowed, scanning the shadows with renewed suspicion. "Do you smell that?" He took a step closer to the boxes, inhaling deeply, his expression shifting from arrogance to a dangerous alertness. "Lavender," he whispered, the word hanging in the air like a threat. "Cheap, grocery store lavender soap. It smells clean." Elena stopped breathing entirely, her lungs burning as she pressed herself harder against the wall, squeezing her eyes shut as if that could make her invisible. She had showered that morning before coming here, scrubbing her skin with the generic bar soap she bought in bulk for $3. In a basement that reeked of mildew, rust, and dying blood, the faint, floral scent of cleanliness was a beacon screaming that someone had been here. Marcus moved toward the corner, his footsteps slow and deliberate now, one hand reaching into his jacket pocket where the bulge of a gun sat heavy and promising. "Hello," he called out softly, his voice mocking, teasing, as if he were trying to lure a frightened child out from under the bed. "Is someone playing nurse down here?" He stopped directly in front of the wall of boxes, so close that Elena could smell his expensive cologne, a scent of sandalwood and cruelty that made her nauseous. She could see the shine of his polished shoes through the crack in the cardboard. One more step, one shift in angle, and he would see her huddled form. She thought of Noah, waiting for her at the bus stop. She thought of Dominic, helpless on the floor. Her hand drifted to the heavy flashlight she had dragged behind the boxes with her, her fingers gripping the cold metal. If he looked, she would have to swing. She would have to fight. Just as Marcus reached out to shove the top box aside, his phone buzzed violently in his hand, shattering the silence. He cursed under his breath, glancing at the screen, his attention snapping back to the business that drove his soul. "What is it now?" he snapped, answering the call and turning away from the corner, his distraction saving Elena's life by a fraction of an inch. "No, don't sign anything until I get there. I'm leaving now." He cast one last, suspicious look around the basement, his eyes lingering on the shadows for a heartbeat too long before he shook his head. "Rats," he muttered, dismissing the scent as a trick of the damp air. "Filthy place." He turned on his heel and strode up the stairs, the door slamming shut behind him with a finality that shook dust from the ceiling beams. Elena didn't move for a full minute, listening to the car engine roar to life and fade into the distance, her body trembling so violently she couldn't stand. When she finally crawled out, Dominic was already looking at her, his face pale and slick with sweat, his eyes dark with a realization they both shared. They were out of time. The silence that followed the roar of Marcus's engine was heavier than the damp air of the basement, pressing down on Elena's chest like a physical weight. She crawled out from behind the wall of boxes, her limbs stiff and shaking, to find Dominic attempting to pull himself upright against the concrete wall. His face was a mask of strained determination, sweat beading on his forehead as he tested the limits of his healing body, but a sharp gasp of pain cut through his resolve as his hand flew to his bandaged side. He slumped back, eyes squeezing shut in frustration, the reality of his condition crashing down on him with brutal clarity. He was a lion with broken teeth, trapped in a cage while hyenas circled his kingdom. 3 days, he rasped, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I can't heal in 3 days. Not enough to walk into that hotel and take back what is mine." Elena knelt beside him, her heart aching at the sight of his vulnerability, but she offered no false comfort because they both knew the truth. Marcus had set a clock that was ticking faster than Dominic's body could recover, and if they did nothing, Wednesday would mark the end of everything. Dominic opened his eyes, the gray irises dark with a sudden, fierce decision. He reached out and grabbed Elena's hand, his grip weak but urgent, pulling her closer until their faces were inches apart. "I need you to be my hands," he said, his voice low and intense. "I need you to go where I can't." He released her only to struggle with the heavy silver ring on his right hand, twisting the metal over his knuckle until it slid free. He pressed the ring into Elena's palm and closed her fingers over it, his skin burning against hers. The metal was warm from his body, heavy and substantial, bearing an intricate crest engraved deep into the silver surface. "Take this," he commanded, his gaze locking onto hers with a gravity that made the air shiver. "This ring is the only proof I have left. To the right people, it speaks louder than my voice ever could." Elena looked down at the silver band in her hand, feeling the terrifying weight of it. It wasn't just jewelry, it was a key, a seal of authority passed from a fallen king to a cleaner. "Go to Chinatown," Dominic instructed, his words precise and clipped, fighting the exhaustion that threatened to pull him under. "There is a bar on Passing Street called the Red Lantern. It looks like a hole in the wall, but it's neutral ground." He paused to catch his breath, his chest heaving beneath the bandages. "Ask for Jimmy. James Chin. He's the only man in my organization who hasn't been bought by Marcus or Roman." Elena's stomach twisted with fear at the mention of the Red Lantern, a place she had heard whispered warnings about, a place where people like her didn't go after dark. Yet, looking at Dominic, broken and desperate, she knew she couldn't refuse. "What do I tell him?" she asked, clutching the ring so tight the crest imprinted into her skin. "Show him the ring," Dominic said. "Tell him the old man sends his regards from the basement. He'll know what it means." He leaned his head back against the wall, his eyes searching hers, stripping away every layer of defense she had. "Trust no one else, Elena. If you show that ring to the wrong person, you won't make it out of there alive." The gravity of his trust settled over her like a heavy coat. This man, who had spent a lifetime building walls of suspicion and paranoia, was placing his life, his empire, and his vengeance into the hands of a woman who scrubbed floors for a living. It was a gamble of desperate proportions, and the realization that she was his only hope terrified and emboldened her in equal measure. "I'll find him," she promised, her voice finding a steel core she didn't know she possessed. She slipped the ring into the deepest pocket of her jeans, feeling it settle there like a secret heartbeat. "I won't let you down." Dominic looked at her, and for a moment, the hard lines of the Mafia boss vanished, replaced by the raw, naked gratitude of a man who had finally found an ally in the dark. "I know," he whispered, his eyes closing as his strength finally gave out. "Now go, before the shadows get any longer." Elena stood up, took one last look at the man who had become her world in the darkness of a basement, and climbed the stairs, stepping out of the mansion and into a mission that would change her life forever. Chinatown was a maze of rain-slicked pavement and neon lights that bled into the puddles like oil, turning the streets into a blurred kaleidoscope of red and gold. Elena pulled her coat tighter around herself, her hand buried deep in her pocket where the heavy silver ring pressed against her palm like a hot coal. The Red Lantern sat at the end of a narrow alley, its entrance marked only by a faded paper lantern swaying in the wind and a heavy steel door that looked like it could withstand a battering ram. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs as she stepped toward it, every instinct screaming at her to turn around and run back to the safety of her invisible life. But the image of Dominic, pale and broken against the basement wall, anchored her feet to the ground. She wasn't just a cleaner anymore. She was the lifeline for a man who had trusted her with his life, and that responsibility was a gravity she couldn't escape. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, the humid wall of air hitting her with the scent of stale beer, cigarette smoke, and danger. The bar was dimly lit, shadows clinging to the corners like cobwebs, and the low hum of conversation died the instant she crossed the threshold. Dozens of eyes turned to her, hard and assessing, stripping away her anonymity and leaving her exposed. Elena kept her head down, weaving through the tables with a singular focus, ignoring the catcalls and the ominous silence that trailed in her wake. She scanned the room until she saw him in the back booth, just as Dominic had described. James Chin sat alone, a fortress of a man with a shaved head and a tattoo of a dragon curling up his neck, his dark eyes scanning the room with the lethal precision of a sniper. He didn't look like a man who had friends. He looked like a man who buried bodies for a living. Elena forced her legs to carry her forward until she stood directly in front of his table, her shadow falling over his half-empty glass of whiskey. "I didn't order anything," James rumbled without looking up, his voice a deep baritone that vibrated in the table. "And I don't pay for company. Walk away." Elena swallowed the lump of terror in her throat, her fingers curling tighter around the ring in her pocket. "I'm not selling anything," she said, her voice trembling, but loud enough to be heard over the jukebox. "I'm here about a mutual friend." James finally looked up, his gaze hitting her with the force of a physical blow. His eyes were cold, dead things that had seen too much violence to be surprised by anything, and his hand drifted casually beneath his jacket, undoubtedly reaching for a weapon. "I don't have friends," he said flatly, dismissing her with a flick of his fingers. "And if you know what's good for you, you'll leave before I decide you're a nuisance." The threat was clear, backed by the silent muscle of two men at the bar who had started to stand up, sensing their boss's irritation. Elena knew she had seconds before they threw her out into the alley, or worse. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She simply pulled her hand from her pocket and slammed the heavy silver ring onto the scarred wood of the table. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the tense silence. James froze. His eyes locked onto the ring, widening as he recognized the intricate crest engraved on the face, the Crane family seal, worn only by the Don himself. The air left the room. James reached out with a trembling hand, his fingers brushing the cold metal as if he were touching a ghost. "Where did you get this?" he whispered, his voice losing its terrifying edge and cracking with raw emotion. "Dominic Crane is dead. Everyone knows he's dead." Elena leaned in, her voice low and fierce. "The old man sends his regards," she said, repeating the code Dominic had given her. "And he's not dead. He's bleeding out in a basement in South Boston, and he sent me to find you." The transformation in James was instantaneous and terrifying. The apathy vanished, replaced by a razor-sharp intensity that made him seem 10 feet tall. He snatched the ring up, slipping it into his pocket as he stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "He's alive," he breathed, the words more of a prayer than a statement. He looked at Elena with a new respect, seeing her not as an intruder, but as the messenger who had just brought his loyalty back from the grave. He signaled to the men at the bar with a sharp, complex hand gesture, and suddenly the room was in motion. Phones were pulled out, jackets were zipped, and weapons were checked with practiced efficiency. "You," James said, pointing at Elena. "You're coming with us. If you're lying, you won't leave that car. But if he's really there..." He paused, his jaw tightening. "Then we're going to burn the city down to get him back." Elena nodded, accepting the terms. She followed him out into the rain, surrounded by a phalanx of silent, dangerous men, knowing there was no turning back now. The rescue had begun. The extraction team moved with the silent, lethal efficiency of shadows, slipping through the back door of the mansion that Elena had left unlocked just hours before. James Chin led the way, his gun drawn and steady, while 3 of his best men fanned out to secure the perimeter, their movements synchronized in a dance of professional violence. Elena followed close behind James, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird as they descended the stairs into the basement's damp gloom. When the beam of James's flashlight hit Dominic, the big enforcer let out a low, guttural sound, half curse, half prayer, at the sight of his boss broken and bleeding on the concrete floor. "Boss," James whispered, dropping to one knee and holstering his weapon to grip Dominic's shoulder with a hand that trembled slightly. Dominic opened his eyes, the gray irises clouded with pain but sharp with recognition, and a faint, bloody smile ghosted across his lips. "Took you long enough," he rasped, his gaze shifting past James to find Elena standing in the doorway, offering her a look of raw, undisguised gratitude that made her knees weak. Getting him up the stairs was a brutal ordeal, a symphony of suppressed groans and shuffling feet as James and another man hoisted Dominic's weight between them. Every step was a fresh torture for his wounded ribs, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as sweat beaded on his forehead, but he refused to stop, driving himself forward with a will of iron. Elena walked behind them, her hands hovering uselessly, her eyes starting to the shadows at the top of the stairs, terrified that Marcus would materialize out of the darkness. They reached the ground floor without incident, the house silent as a tomb, the only sound the heavy, ragged breathing of the wounded man. "Clear," James signaled, and they moved toward the back exit, the cold night air washing over them as they stepped out onto the wet grass of the lawn. Freedom was 50 yards away, a black van waiting with its engine idling in the alley, a beacon of safety in the suffocating night. Elena allowed herself a single, fragile breath of relief, thinking that maybe, just maybe, the universe was finally on their side. Then the world exploded into blinding white light. Floodlights hidden in the trees and mounted on the roof snapped on simultaneously, searing the darkness away in a heartbeat and pinning them against the manicured lawn like insects under a microscope. Elena gasped, throwing her hands up to shield her eyes, stumbling blindly into James's back as the group ground to a halt. "Drop it," a voice boomed from the glare, amplified and distorted, but chillingly familiar. "Hands where I can see them, or we turn the Maid into Swiss cheese." James froze, his hand hovering over his weapon, but a dozen red laser dots appeared on his chest and Dominic's, dancing across their clothes like deadly fireflies. They were surrounded. From the perimeter of the light, a ring of armed men stepped forward, their assault rifles raised and steady, forming a wall of steel that offered no escape. Marcus walked into the circle of light, slow and theatrical, clapping his hands with a slow, mocking rhythm that echoed across the yard. Beside him walked an older man with silver hair and the cold, dead eyes of a shark, Roman Castellano, the rival boss who had wanted Dominic dead for a decade. "Bravo," Marcus sneered, stopping 10 feet away and looking at Elena with a mixture of amusement and disgust. "I have to admit, I didn't think you had it in you." The Maid playing the hero. He shook his head, feigning disappointment as he pulled a cigarette from his pocket and lit it, the flame illuminating the cruel satisfaction on his face. "Did you really think you could walk into the Red Lantern without me knowing?" he asked, exhaling a plume of smoke. "I've had eyes on that place for weeks. I just needed to see who would be stupid enough to take the bait." Roman laughed, a dry, rasping sound, and stepped closer to Dominic, looking at the wounded king with pure contempt. "Look at you," Roman spat. "Broken by your own brother, rescued by a cleaning lady. It's pathetic." Dominic straightened, shaking off James's support to stand on his own trembling legs, his eyes blazing with a hatred that burned hotter than the floodlights. "It's not over," he growled. Marcus smiled, a cold, empty expression that promised only death. "Oh, big brother," he said softly, signaling his men to take aim. It was over the moment she opened that door. James Chin did not become the right hand of the Crane family by waiting for permission to breathe, and he certainly wasn't going to wait for Marcus to give the order to fire. In the split second between Marcus's smirk and the tightening of a guard's trigger finger, James moved with a speed that defied his size. He didn't aim for the brothers, he aimed for the floodlight closest to them, his gun barking twice in rapid succession. The glass shattered, plunging the left side of the yard into sudden, disorienting shadow, and chaos erupted like a kicked hornet's nest. Gunfire tore through the night air, deafening and chaotic, as James's men returned fire, creating a wall of noise and lead. Elena screamed as James shoved her hard, sending her sprawling onto the wet grass behind the cover of a stone garden planter. Dirt and grass kicked up into her face as bullets chewed up the ground where she had been standing just a heartbeat before. The world dissolved into a terrifying blur of muzzle flashes, shouting voices, and the distinct, high-pitched whine of ricochets off the mansion's stone walls. Dominic had been knocked down in the initial scramble, his weakened body unable to keep his footing, but he wasn't out of the fight. He crawled through the mud, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his hand searching the grass until his fingers closed around the grip of a pistol dropped by one of James's fallen men. He didn't have the strength to aim properly, didn't have the steady hands of the marksman he used to be, but he had the rage of a king watching his kingdom burn. He fired blindly toward the silhouette of his brother, forcing Marcus to duck behind his bodyguards, buying his team a few precious seconds of suppressive fire. But Roman Castellano wasn't looking at Dominic. The old wolf was looking at the woman huddled behind the planter, the witness, the loose end that could tie this entire massacre back to him. Elena looked up, wiping mud from her eyes, and saw Roman step out from behind the cover of a sedan, his weapon raised and leveled directly at her chest. His eyes met hers, cold and dead, promising an end that would be quick and silent. She couldn't move. Fear paralyzed her limbs, freezing her in place as she watched the barrel steady on her heart. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the impact, waiting for the end. But the shot never came. Instead, a heavy weight slammed into her from the side, knocking the air from her lungs and driving her flat into the earth. A grunt of agony echoed right beside her ear, wet and terrible, followed by the sickening sound of a bullet striking flesh. Elena opened her eyes to find Dominic draped over her, his body acting as a human shield, his face buried in the crook of her neck. He convulsed once, a spasm of pure pain, and then went heavy, his dead weight pinning her to the ground. "Dominic," she screamed, the sound tearing from her throat as she realized what he had done. He hadn't just pushed her out of the way, he had caught the bullet meant for her. Warm blood began to soak through his shirt, pressing hot and sticky against her chest, mingling with the mud and the rain that had started to fall again. Roman cursed, racking the slide of his gun to finish the job, but he never got the chance. Tires screeched on the pavement behind the mansion, a sound so loud it cut through the gunfire. 3 black SUVs roared across the lawn, smashing through the garden fence, their high beams blinding the attackers. The back doors flew open before the vehicles even stopped, and a dozen heavily armed men poured out, James's second wave, the reinforcements he had called the moment he saw the ring in the bar. Automatic gunfire raked the enemy positions, turning the tide of the battle in seconds. The surprise was total. Marcus, realizing he was suddenly outgunned and exposed, didn't hesitate. He scrambled into his car, leaving his men to die, his survival instinct overriding his pride. Roman fired one last frustrated shot into the dirt before diving into his own vehicle, the 2 villains fleeing into the night as their ambush crumbled around them. The shooting stopped as quickly as it had begun, replaced by the shouts of James's men securing the perimeter and the groans of the wounded. James sprinted across the lawn, sliding to his knees beside Elena and Dominic, his face a mask of panic. "Boss," he yelled, rolling Dominic off of Elena with gentle, desperate hands. Dominic was unconscious, his skin gray, his breathing shallow and erratic. The new bullet had caught him in the back, just below the shoulder blade, dangerously close to his spine and lungs. Elena scrambled up, her hands covered in his blood, her nurse's training overriding her terror. She pressed her hands hard against the new wound, trying to stem the flow, but the blood pumped out between her fingers, dark and fast. "We have to go," she cried, looking up at James with wild eyes. "He's losing too much blood. He won't make it to a hospital." James shook his head, his jaw sat in grim determination. "No hospitals," he barked, motioning for his men to bring a stretcher. "Marcus will be watching the yars. We have to go to the safe house. Move." "No." They lifted Dominic, his body limp and broken, and ran toward the waiting SUVs. Elena ran beside him, her hand gripping his cold fingers, praying harder than she had ever prayed in her life that the man who had died to save her would live long enough to let her return the favor. The convoy of black SUVs tore through the forest roads like a streak of midnight lightning, leaving the chaos of the city far behind in the rearview mirror. In the back seat of the lead vehicle, Elena pressed a towel against Dominic's shoulder with desperate strength, her body swaying with every sharp turn as the tires fought for grip on the gravel. Dominic was fading in and out of consciousness, his head resting heavily on her lap, his skin clammy and pale under the flickering interior lights. "Stay with me," she whispered fiercely, brushing the damp hair from his forehead with blood-stained fingers. "You don't get to die now. Not after everything." He groaned, a low sound of agony that vibrated through her legs, but his hand sought hers in the darkness, gripping her fingers with a weak, trembling hold that felt like a lifeline. James' chin drove with icy precision, his eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror, checking for pursuers that thankfully hadn't materialized. 5 minutes, boss," James called out, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Just hold on for 5 more minutes." To Elena, those minutes stretched into an eternity, each second measured by the ragged rhythm of Dominic's breathing and the terrifying amount of blood soaking into the leather seat beneath them. The safe house was a rustic cabin buried deep in the woods, invisible from the main road and fortified like a bunker. They didn't wait for the vehicle to stop completely before the doors flew open, and James's men were there, lifting Dominic with practiced care and carrying him inside. The main room had been cleared, the heavy oak dining table transformed into a makeshift operating theater under the glare of portable surgical lights. A man was already waiting there, Dr. Silas, a surgeon who had lost his license years ago for gambling debts and now paid them off by stitching up bullet holes in the middle of the night. He was brisk and professional, barking orders as he cut away Dominic's ruined shirt. "Get her out of here," he snapped, glancing at Elena, who stood frozen near the door, her clothes ruined, her face a mask of shock. James gently took her arm, guiding her into the hallway. "Let him work, Elena," he said softly, his voice lacking its usual hardness. "There's nothing more you can do right now." The door clicked shut, severing her connection to the man she had just watched take a bullet for her, leaving her alone in the quiet corridor with the scent of antiseptic and fear. Elena sank onto a wooden bench in the hallway, staring at her hands. They were stained crimson, the blood dried into the creases of her knuckles and under her fingernails, a visceral map of the violence she had just survived. She felt numb, a strange, hollow sensation that sat heavy in her chest, displacing the terror that should have been there. James sat down across from her, leaning his elbows on his knees, looking weary and older than he had in the bar. He handed her a bottle of water, the plastic crinkling loudly in the silence. "He took that shot for you," James said, his dark eyes studying her with a new, profound respect. "In 20 years, I have never seen Dominic Crane put himself in front of a bullet for anyone. Not for money, not for power, not even for family." Elena looked up, her throat tight. "He didn't have to," she whispered. "He was barely standing." James nodded slowly. "That's exactly why he did it. You brought him back from the dead, Elena. Tonight, he returned the favor." The realization settled over her, warm and terrifying. This wasn't just a debt being paid. It was something deeper, something that bound their souls together in a way that terrified her sensible heart. Hours bled into the night, marked only by the muffled clink of metal instruments and the low murmur of the doctor's voice from the other room. Elena washed her hands in the small bathroom sink, scrubbing until her skin was raw and pink, but the phantom sensation of Dominic's blood remained. She thought of Noah, safe at the neighbor's house, and felt a pang of guilt for being here, deep in the woods with a Mafia warlord, but she knew she couldn't leave. Not until she saw his eyes open. Finally, the door opened, and Dr. Silas stepped out, peeling off latex gloves with a tired snap. "He's stable," the doctor announced, wiping sweat from his brow. "The bullet missed the spine by an inch and nicked the lung, but I stopped the bleeding and repaired the damage. He's tough as hell, but he needs rest." Elena let out a breath she felt like she had been holding since the ambush, her knees going weak with relief. "Can I see him?" she asked, already moving toward the door. The doctor nodded, stepping aside. "Be brief. He's groggy." The room was dim, lit only by a single lamp in the corner that cast long shadows across the walls. Dominic lay on the table, which had been covered with clean sheets, his chest wrapped in fresh white bandages that stood out starkly against his bruised skin. And 4 drips stood beside him, the clear fluid ticking away the seconds of his recovery. Elena pulled a chair close to the makeshift bed and sat down, taking his hand in hers. His skin was warmer now, the chill of shock fading as the blood transfusion did its work. She watched the steady rise and fall of his chest, tears finally spilling over her lashes to track silently down her cheeks. "You idiot," she whispered, a watery laugh escaping her lips. "You promised to protect me, not die for me." As if hearing her voice, Dominic's eyelids fluttered, heavy and slow. He blinked against the dim light, his gaze unfocused for a moment before locking onto her face. A faint, tired smile touched the corners of his mouth. "I'm not dead yet," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "I still owe you dinner." Elena squeezed his hand, pressing it against her cheek, needing the physical confirmation of his life. "Why did you do it?" she asked, the question tumbling out before she could stop it. "You could have stayed down. You didn't have to jump." Dominic looked at her, his gray eyes dark with pain but completely clear in their intent. He didn't answer with a joke or a deflection this time, "Because looking at you in that crosshair." He paused, swallowing dryly. "It scared me more than dying ever could." He shifted his fingers, brushing a tear from her cheek with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "I didn't save you because you're useful, Elena. I saved you because somewhere in that basement, between the fever and the darkness, you became the only thing I couldn't bear to lose." The confession hung in the air between them, stripping away the last of their defenses. There, in a cabin surrounded by enemies and darkness, Elena realized she wasn't just the cleaner who found a body, and he wasn't just the boss who needed a nurse. They were two broken halves that had finally found their whole, and for the first time in her life, she didn't want to run away. The convoy of black SUVs tore through the forest roads like a streak of midnight lightning, leaving the chaos of the city far behind in the rearview mirror, and 2 days later, that same silence was broken by the arrival of James Chin carrying the most precious cargo of all. Elena ran to the heavy oak door, throwing it open just as James stepped out of the vehicle, holding the small hand of a terrified 6-year-old boy. "Mom," Noah screamed, breaking free from the scary giant's grip and sprinting across the porch to bury his face in Elena's stomach. She fell to her knees, wrapping her arms around him so tightly that he squeaked in protest, burying her nose in his hair to inhale the scent of childhood shampoo and innocence. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and fast, as the last knot of tension in her chest finally unraveled. Marcus had threatened to erase him, to stop him from reaching the school bus, but here he was, safe and whole, pulled from the line of fire by the very people she had been terrified to trust. James stood by the car, watching the reunion with a stoic expression, but a faint softness lingered around his eyes. "He was brave," the enforcer said, nodding at the boy. "Didn't cry once, even when we had to switch cars." Noah eventually pulled back, wiping his nose on his sleeve, his eyes wide as he took in the strange cabin, the armed men standing guard by the trees, and finally, the man sitting in the armchair by the fireplace. Dominic was still pale, his shoulder heavily bandaged and his movements stiff, but he was upright, watching the boy with an expression Elena couldn't quite read. Noah took a step back, gripping Elena's hand with white-knuckled force. "Is that the bad man?" he whispered, loud enough for the whole room to hear. Elena stiffened, about to hush him, but Dominic held up a hand to stop her. He didn't get angry. He didn't demand respect. Instead, he did something that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. The man who made grown men tremble slowly lowered himself from the chair, wincing as his injuries protested, until he was kneeling on the rug, bringing himself down to the eye level of a 6-year-old. "I'm not the bad man," Dominic said, his voice grave and serious, offering Noah the dignity of an equal. "I'm the man your mother saved. And, because of that, I'm the man who is going to make sure nothing bad ever happens to you." Noah studied him with the unblinking scrutiny that only children possess, looking for a lie in the gray eyes that had seen too much darkness. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him, because his grip on Elena's hand loosened. "Do you know how to play Go Fish?" Noah asked, challenging the Mafia Don with a tilted chin. Dominic's lips quirked into a genuine smile, the first real one Elena had seen reach his eyes since the basement. I don't, Dominic admitted. But I know how to play blackjack. It's better for math. For the next hour, the cabin was filled with the surreal sight of the most feared crime lord in Boston teaching a first grader how to count cards. Dominic was patient, his voice low and encouraging, never snapping when Noah dropped the cards or got the math wrong. Elena watched from the kitchen doorway, her heart aching with a strange, fierce hope. She saw the way Dominic looked at Noah, not as a burden or a pawn, but as something precious, something to be protected at all costs. In the quiet warmth of the firelight, the lines between the cleaner and the king blurred until they were just a family, forged in fire and bound by blood. But peace was a luxury they couldn't afford for long. That evening, after Noah had fallen asleep in the back bedroom, the atmosphere in the main room shifted from domestic warmth to cold, hard strategy. James spread a blueprint of the Crown Hotel across the dining table, weighing down the corners with ammunition clips. The meeting is set for tomorrow at noon, James reported, tapping a location on the 30th floor. Marcus is signing the transfer papers with Roman. Once the ink is dry, they'll announce your death and split the territory. Dominic stood over the map, his face hardening into the mask of the boss Elena had first feared. Let them sign, he said coldly. Let them think they've won. He traced the line of the elevator shaft with a finger. We're not going in with guns blazing this time, Jimmy. If we turn this into a war, the feds will bury all of us. He looked up, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous intelligence. We're going to walk in through the front door. We're going to let the world see that the king isn't dead. He turned to Elena, his expression softening just a fraction. And when the police come, and they will come, they won't be coming for me. The Crown Hotel rose like a fortress of glass and steel in the heart of downtown Boston, its 30th floor conference room offering a panoramic view of the city that Marcus Crane believed he finally owned. The atmosphere inside was thick with the smoke of expensive cigars and the heavy scent of premature victory as the traitorous brother sat at the head of the mahogany table, a gold fountain pen hovering over the transfer documents. Roman Castellano sat opposite him, leaning back in his leather chair with the satisfied grin of a wolf that had just finished a very long hunt, his eyes gleaming as he watched the Crane Empire disintegrate with a signature. "Sign it, kid," Roman urged, his voice rough with anticipation. "Then we open the champagne and toast to new beginnings." Marcus smiled, a weak, vain expression that didn't quite reach his cold eyes, and pressed the nib to the paper. He was seconds away from becoming the king he had always believed he deserved to be, seconds away from burying his brother's memory under a mountain of ink and legal jargon. But the pen never finished the first letter of his name. The heavy double doors at the end of the room flew open with a resounding crash that shook the crystal glasses on the sidebar, silencing the room instantly. Every head turned, and for a moment, the silence was absolute, a vacuum where breath and heartbeats simply ceased to exist. Dominic Crane walked in, flanked not by an army of hit men, but by James Chin and a phalanx of stone-faced attorneys in sharp charcoal suits. He moved slowly, his left arm held stiffly against his side to protect his healing wounds, but his spine was steel and his gray eyes burned with a cold, terrifying fire. He didn't look like a corpse, he looked like a resurrection. "Hello, little brother," Dominic said, his voice quiet but carrying across the room like the crack of a whip. "I believe that chair belongs to me." The color drained from Marcus's face so fast he looked like he was about to faint, the gold pen slipping from his numb fingers to clatter loudly onto the table. "You're dead," Marcus stammered, pushing himself up with trembling hands, his eyes wide with the horror of seeing a ghost. "I saw the body. I kicked the body." Dominic stopped at the foot of the table, resting his good hand on the wood, his gaze sweeping over the traitors who had gathered to pick his bones clean. "You saw what you wanted to see," Dominic replied coldly, "because you were too cowardly to check for a pulse." Roman Castellano recovered from the shock faster than Marcus, his survival instinct screaming that this was a trap. He snarled, reaching inside his jacket for the pistol he always carried, deciding in a split second that if Dominic wasn't dead yet, he would finish the job right now in front of the witnesses. "Kill him," Roman roared to his bodyguards, leveling his weapon at Dominic's chest. But before his finger could tighten on the trigger, the service doors behind the lawyers burst open. "FBI, drop the weapon. Now." The shout was followed by a swarm of tactical agents pouring into the room, their armored vests emblazoned with yellow letters, their rifles raised and ready. Roman froze, his eyes darting frantically between Dominic and the federal agents, realizing too late that the game had changed completely. Dominic hadn't come to start a war. He had come to end one using the only weapon Roman could outgun. "It's over, Roman," Dominic said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I gave them the ledger. The racketeering, the murders, the trafficking. They have everything." The realization hit Roman like a physical blow. Dominic Crane, the man who lived by the code of silence, had broken the cardinal rule of the underworld to take him down. Roman was slammed face-first onto the table by 3 agents, handcuffs clicking tight around his wrists as he screamed curses that echoed off the glass walls. "You rat." Roman spat as he was dragged past Dominic, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth. "You're dead, Crane. You hear me? You're dead." Dominic didn't even blink, watching his rival get hauled away with the indifference of a man taking out the trash. "Enjoy retirement," he murmured. Slowly, the room emptied until only the FBI agents securing the evidence, James Chin and the 2 brothers, remained. Marcus stood by the window, shaking violently, tears of terror streaming down his face as he realized he was completely alone. He looked at Dominic, searching for a trace of the brother who used to protect him, but found only a stranger with ice in his veins. "Dominic, please," Marcus sobbed, falling to his knees. "He forced me. Roman forced me. I didn't want to do it." Dominic walked around the table, stopping in front of his weeping brother. He looked down, remembering the basement, the darkness, the kick to his ribs, and the threat against a 6-year-old boy. He pulled a gun from James's holster, the weight of it familiar and heavy in his hand. Marcus screamed, curling into a ball, begging for his life. "Don't kill me. I'm your brother. We're blood." Dominic aimed the gun at Marcus's head, his finger resting on the trigger, the silence stretching until it was almost unbearable. Then, slowly, he lowered the weapon. "I'm not going to kill you," Dominic said, his voice hollow. "Because death is too easy. It's too quick." He turned to the lead FBI agent who was waiting respectfully by the door. "He's all yours. Accessory to attempted murder, conspiracy, fraud. Take him." Marcus looked up, confusion warring with relief, realizing he was being spared only to be buried in a concrete cell for the rest of his life. "Why?" Marcus whispered, watching Dominic turn his back. "Why didn't you shoot?" Dominic stopped at the door, glancing back over his shoulder one last time. "Because I'm not you," he said simply. "And I have a dinner date I can't be late for." The media storm that followed the arrest of Marcus Crane and Roman Castellano was a hurricane that raged for weeks, splashing Elena's face across newspapers and television screens under headlines like "The Angel of the Basement" and "The Maid Who Took Down the Mob." For a month, she couldn't leave her apartment without being blinded by flashbulbs, and she had to pull Noah out of school just to shield him from the questions. But eventually, as all storms do, the noise began to fade, replaced by the next scandal, leaving the streets of South Boston quiet once again. Elena sat at her kitchen table, staring at a stack of overdue bills that hadn't magically disappeared just because she was famous for 15 minutes. The silence of the apartment felt heavy, not with fear, but with a lingering sense of waiting, as if the other shoe had yet to drop. Then came the knock. It wasn't the frantic pounding of a fugitive or the heavy fist of a hitman, but 3 steady, confident raps that echoed with a familiarity she felt in her bones. She opened the door to find Dominic Crane standing in her hallway, looking nothing like the dying man she had nursed in the dark. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than her building, his hair perfectly styled, the only sign of his ordeal being the slight stiffness in his left shoulder and the darkness that still lingered in the depths of his gray eyes. He didn't ask to come in. He simply stepped over the threshold as if he belonged there, his presence filling the small, cramping space with an energy that made the air hum. He placed a thick, cream-colored envelope on the scarred laminate table, the sound sharp in the quiet room. $2 million, Dominic said, his voice devoid of emotion. Considerate payment for services rendered. Medical care, discretion, and saving my life. He nudged the envelope toward her. It's enough to buy a house in the suburbs, put Noah through college, and ensure you never have to scrub another toilet for as long as you live. Elena looked at the envelope, then up at him, her expression hardening. She felt a flash of anger, hot and bright. He was doing it again, trying to transact his way out of intimacy, trying to turn what they had shared in the dark into a business deal he could close and file away. She picked up the envelope and shoved it back against his chest, hard enough to make him take a half step back. I didn't save a bank account, Dominic, she said, her voice steady and fierce. I saved a man. And if you think you can buy me off like one of your politicians so you don't have to feel indebted to a maid, then you can get out. Dominic stared at her, and slowly, the mask of the untouchable boss cracked. A small, genuine smile touched his lips, one that reached his eyes and softened the hard lines of his face. I told James you wouldn't take it, he admitted, sliding the envelope into his jacket pocket. But I had to be sure. I had to know if you are the woman I thought you were. He took a step closer, crowding her space, the scent of sandalwood and rain wrapping around her. I'm dismantling the illegal operations, Elena. The drugs, the trafficking, it's gone. I'm keeping the casinos and the hotels, legitimizing everything. It's going to be messy and dangerous and hard. He reached out, taking her hand in his thumb tracing the calluses on her palm. I can't do it alone. I need someone who isn't afraid of the dark. Someone who reminds me that even monsters can be redeemed. 1 year later, the Second Chance Foundation opened its doors in a renovated brownstone in downtown Boston, just blocks away from the Crown Hotel. The grand opening was a black tie affair attended by the city's elite, but the guests of honor weren't the politicians or the billionaires. They were the people standing in the back, the cleaners, the dishwashers, the invisible workers whom the city relied on but refused to see. Elena stood on the balcony overlooking the ballroom, wearing a silk gown that shimmered like moonlight, her hand resting on the railing where she watched Noah running through the crowd in a miniature tuxedo, laughing as James Chin chased him with a plate of hors d'oeuvres. She felt a hand on the small of her back, warm and steady, and leaned into it before she even turned around. Dominic stood beside her, looking out at the empire they were rebuilding together, not one of fear and silence, but one of voice and opportunity. The scars on his chest were healed now, faded white lines that mapped the night he had chosen love over survival, just as the scars on her heart had healed under his patient, protective care. You know, Dominic murmured, leaning down to press a kiss to her temple. They're calling you the Queen of Boston now. Elena laughed, shaking her head as she looked out at the skyline that glittered like a sea of diamonds. Let them talk, she whispered, turning in his arms to face him. I never wanted to be a queen. I just wanted to be seen. Dominic cupped her face in his hands, his gray eyes filled with a devotion that banished the last shadows of their past. I see you, Elena, he promised, his voice rough with emotion. I have always seen you. They kissed under the stars, two survivors who had found each other in the wreckage of their lives and built a fortress of hope on the foundation of a single act of kindness. They had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and come out the other side not as victims, but as victors. The cleaner and the king, ruling a world where no one would ever be left to die in the dark again. Elena's story reminds us that courage does not always roar. Sometimes courage is the quiet voice at the end of the day saying, I will try again tomorrow. It teaches us that we are never truly invisible, for our actions ripple outward in ways we may never see, touching lives and changing destinies. It shows us that love is not about finding someone perfect, but about finding someone who helps you fight your battles, someone who stands in front of the bullet when the world tries to take you down. And most importantly, it proves that no matter how deep the hole or how dark the night, there is always a way back to the light if you are brave enough to reach for a hand. Thank you for journeying with us through this tale of danger, redemption, and love here on Sunni Romance. We tell these stories because we believe in the power of the human spirit to overcome the impossible. Now, I want to ask you a question, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments below. Have you ever been the person in the dark waiting for help, or have you been the one to hold out a hand when it wasn't safe to do so? We read every single comment, and your stories inspire us to keep creating. If Elena and Dominic's journey touched your heart, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs a reminder that they matter, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a moment of emotion. Until next time, remember to look out for the invisible people in your life. You never know when you might be saving a king. Goodbye for now.